Welcome to Session 4 of the Online Human Rights Training. In this session, you will learn about restrictions, abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Restriction of rights. Individuals' rights can be restricted or limited. As a DSP or sponsor, you will never make the decision to restrict or limit a person's rights. Access to service records. Access to all or part of the individual's service record may be denied or limited only if a professional involved is providing services to the individual and assesses that viewing the record could be physically or mentally harmful to the individual. The best example I have for this is, let's say that an individual suffered severe abuse as a child, and that information is in their service record in the history part of that record. A professional such as a psychiatrist or behavioral specialist may say that accessing that part of the service record could cause mental harm to the individual. At that point, they would seal the record. As a DSP, you really don't need to worry about this. The QIDP is going to help the individual to understand why viewing that part of the record has been sealed. Access to service records. Providers shall inform those served how they can access and request amendments of their service record. Providers shall permit each individual to see their service record when requested. The record is a legal document. It cannot be changed, but it can be amended. Which is why when you are writing documentation, we ask you not to scribble out or erase anything when we were actually doing paper documentation. That's a little bit easier now that we are using computers. But if an individual feels that their service record needs to be amended, they can make that request. And what you want to do is direct them to their QIDP for assistance. As we discussed earlier, we can limit access to the record. But prior to doing that, a trained professional, such as a behavioral specialist, a psychiatrist, or someone else approved as a professional, must first talk with the individual about why viewing the record is unsafe for them, document the reason viewing the record could be mentally or physically harmful to the individual, and review limitation on a regular basis and remove limitations when no longer necessary. As we discussed a little bit earlier, when it comes to restrictions of rights, you as a DSP or sponsor will never make the decision to place a restriction or a limit on someone's human rights. The regulations state that a qualified professional is the only person that can make that decision with the individual or their authorized representative. The regulations also list what deems to be a qualified professional. So let's take a look at when restricting rights. The rules are pretty much the same for anything. Any restriction must be discussed with the individual prior to implementation. Rationale for restrictions must be clearly documented in the individual's record. Qualified professionals shall regularly review every restriction, and restrictions must be discontinued when the individual has met the criteria for removal. Restrictions of rights continued. Restrictions may be imposed if a court has so ordered, and program rules may be developed and enforced if they do not conflict with regulations or any individual service plan, and the rules are needed to maintain a safe and orderly environment. Support Services of Virginia does have program rules. We're going to discuss those in just a few moments. You will see this document posted in the residential and day support sites. This document should also be posted in all sponsor homes. Again, the regulations require providers to develop program rules. These rules act as a guideline for behavior. We do not use these rules as a form of punishment. Let's take a look at the program rules. When I participate in any SSVA program, I agree to be safe. I will not threaten others, inappropriately touch others, hurt others, or throw objects. I understand that if I do, any of these things may occur. The police may be called. I may be given time off from the program. Legal or abuse charges may be filed against me. I may have to pay for repairs. As a DSP or a sponsor, if an individual engages in any of the above actions, you would intervene using the skills you've been taught in crisis intervention to stabilize the situation. The QIDP or behavioral specialist would then develop a plan of supports to minimize the risk of the action reoccurring. The QIDP may review the program rules with the individual and use it as a tool to explain why an action was taken. For example, Johnny and his roommate live together. They both receive services. One day, Johnny hits his roommate, and now the roommate is filing an allegation of abuse against him. The QIDP may use the document to remind the individual that inappropriately touching others can result in abuse charges being filed against him. The program rules are reviewed with each individual upon intake into services and then annually thereafter, and are retained in the individual's file. Rights to protection and services. Each individual has the right to be protected from harm, including abuse, neglect, and exploitation, and to have help in learning about, applying for, and fully using the public services or benefits to which he or she may be entitled. When it comes to being protected from harm, including abuse, neglect, and exploitation, this is a top priority that we have as a DSP. And that priority is protecting the individuals we support from harm, to include abuse, neglect, and exploitation. We are here to speak for people who cannot speak for themselves and to advocate for the individuals. Let's take a look at the definition of abuse. The definition of abuse. Abuse means any act or failure to act by an employee or other person responsible for the care of the individual that was performed or was failed to be performed knowingly, recklessly, or intentionally, and that caused or might have caused physical or psychological harm, injury, or death to an individual receiving services. Notice that this regulation says knowingly, recklessly, or intentionally. That is what the internal human rights advocate and the LHRC are looking for when conducting investigations. Did the support worker, roommate, or member of the general public knowingly, recklessly, or intentionally abuse, neglect, or exploit the individual? When it comes to human rights, there are some gray areas that we have to be careful of. When you receive training and acknowledge an ISP and TheraP, it is documentation that you know how to provide care for the person you're supporting. Therefore, failure to provide care as outlined for that individual could be neglect and would be knowingly caused because you acknowledged it and we have documentation that you said that you know how to support the person. An example of this would be, let's say an individual is left sitting in urine-soaked briefs for an extended period of time. Would that be neglect? Well, the answer is it could be. It is definitely sad and disheartening that a DSP would overlook something so important, but let's say that the DSP who was supporting that person on that day had never ever supported that person before, or a person with disabilities for that matter. And it's their first time working with this individual. No one had ever told them the person wore a brief and needed assistance in the bathroom, and that particular DSP did not have time to read or acknowledge the ISP prior to working that shift. A coworker discovers that the individual has not had assistance in a very long time and informs the DSP of the situation, and together they help change the individual's brief. The new DSP apologizes to the individual and their coworker, and it never happens again. Is that neglect? Did the person knowingly, recklessly, and intentionally try to cause harm to the individual? And the answer is no. And they corrected the potential violation. So even though it was a crappy situation and not something that we want to happen, the person responsible didn't knowingly and recklessly try to be harmful to the individual. On the other hand, though, let's say that a DSP had been working with an individual for over 6 months, and it's documented that they have had training on the ISP plan, and during the investigation it was found that the DSP often leaves the individual to sit in urine-soaked briefs. Would that be neglect? And the answer is yes. And the reason it is neglect is because it was done knowingly, recklessly, or intentionally. There are, however, some clear-cut forms of abuse. Let's take a look at the next slide. Types of abuse would include rape, sexual assault or other criminal sexual behavior, assault or battery, use of language that demeans, threatens, intimidates, or humiliates the person, and exploitation. For rape, sexual assault, other criminal sexual behavior, assault and battery, those are things that are clear-cut. You do not pass go, you do not get to collect $200, you just simply shouldn't be working with people with intellectual disabilities. These are things that are defined as just shouldn't happen, and people should definitely know better, and they're done knowingly, recklessly, or intentionally. When it comes to use of language that demeans, threatens, intimidates, or humiliates a person, sometimes that can be a gray area, and so I want to clearly define that most people get themselves in trouble with this portion of the regulation because they're not following positive practices, or they're treating individuals like children as opposed to adults. What you'll notice is that we focus a lot on how to communicate with individuals during our positive practices training. We want to make sure that we're being respectful and talking to people we support like adults, not like children. Also, we have a policy that states that SSVA does not condone the use of punishment in any form. As long as you adhere to the policies of positive practices and our policies on punishment, you shouldn't run into problems using language that would get you into trouble. So be very mindful of what language you're using. Another thing that we want to define for you is the definition of neglect. Neglect means the failure by an individual, program, or facility responsible for providing services to provide nourishment, treatment, care, goods, or services necessary to the health, safety, or welfare of the person receiving care. Neglect falls under abuse. So we can be abusing individuals because of neglect, because we're neglecting them. Exploitation. Exploitation means the misuse or misappropriation of an individual's assets, goods, or property. Exploitation also includes the use of a position of real or perceived authority to extract personal gain from an individual. Most associates get themselves into trouble when it comes to exploitation. Therefore, Jean Cullison has created an excellent document to help you better understand exploitation. Let's go ahead and take a look at it. This is the handout that we have for understanding exploitation. What this does is it helps you to understand what SSVA considers to be exploitation, and it's a very helpful guide in helping protect you from exploiting our individuals. What you'll notice is at the top of this document, we've taken some excerpts from the human rights regulations. Those include the first bullet point, which is the misuse or misappropriation of the individual's assets, goods, or property. An example of this would be if you were to work at an individual's house in residential and you decided to eat their food because you forgot to pack your dinner or to pack your snack for that evening, so you thought it would be okay just to eat the food that they have. That is considered misappropriation or misuse of the person's goods, and that can get you into trouble with exploitation. In sponsored residential, an example could be using the individual's food stamps to purchase dinner items for a personal friend's birthday party. So in other words, you're using their goods or their assets to have personal gain in that situation. When it comes to the second bullet point, exploitation also including the position of authority to extract personal gain, we want to be really careful of that one as well. If you're not conducting personal business while on shift, you shouldn't run into trouble with this. But the best example I could come up with would be saying to an individual something like, if you don't go with me to the nail salon to get my nails done today, I'm not going to be able to take you to the bank after. Even wording that differently doesn't make it any better. And I think that sometimes people can think that if I word it in a way that seems less threatening or less intimidating to an individual, it's okay. And that's not the case. We call this coercion. So if I'm coercing a person into doing something for my personal gain, that can also be exploitation. And so wording that phrase differently by saying to the individual, as soon as I finish getting my nails done, we can go to the bank, and then you make the individual sit there and wait until you finish getting your nails done, you're still exploiting them. So be mindful of that and take into consideration, again, if I'm not conducting personal business while on shift, then I'm not going to get in trouble when it comes to exploitation. Also on this document, you'll see that Jean has put a thought in your head, okay? So in this box, You're going to see an easy way to understand what could be considered exploitation is to think before you act. And we want you to always think before you act. And what we want you to think is, before you do something, think to yourself, will I benefit from doing this with the customer? If there's a benefit in it for you, other than that great feeling you get of spending time with the individual, then you could be at risk for exploiting them. Some other things which are considered to be exploitation, according to Support Services of Virginia, would be buying, selling, trading, or swapping items of value. We consider anything worth more than $1 to be of value. I think in an earlier slide I told you $2, so around $1 to $2. Anything over that we're considering to be of value. And again, like I said earlier, just get into the habit of not buying anything from our individuals and not selling anything to them. And also be careful when swapping out items. We don't always know if the individual truly understands the consequence or what's all entailed of the swap or the trade or the sale. So just get into a practice of not doing that at all. Using a customer or knowledge of a customer's information to produce benefit for yourself. Again, you're going to have access to a lot of confidential information, social security numbers, for instance. We are not using our folks' information for personal gain, and that's just the bottom line. Using a person or situation in an unfair way. So we want to think about that as well. Is this an unfair situation for the person? Am I being fair in what I'm offering? You're going to develop relationships with our individuals to where they're going to want to please you, unfortunately. We want to please our friends. The individuals are going to want to please you in the same way. Don't coerce people into doing things just because you know they'll do it, just because you know that you have that pull on them. Again, it's just not a good way to treat people, and it puts you at risk. Jean's also defined on this handout what items we consider of value, and it's, again, just a guideline to keep in the back of your head. But things of value would be money or other financial assets, access to money or financial assets, items or actions which could produce personal gain, and then again, items or actions which could create a cost to the individual. At the bottom of this form, again, there's another little thought in your head, and that thought is, but the customer said it was okay, they wanted me to do it. Well, even if that's the case, it can still be exploitation. And an example of that would be, I have a cable bill that's due, and I have to pay that by 5 o'clock, but my shift runs until 9 o'clock at night. And so I have this weight on me, and I'm saying, oh my gosh, if I don't get this paid, I'm going to be without my cable. So I say to the individual I'm working with, well, hey, I have an idea. How about we go to Cox Cable and I will teach you how to pay a bill? How does that sound? And the individual says, yeah, I want to do that. And so you go to Cox Cable and you stand in that ridiculously long line and you pay your bill, and then you take the individual out for ice cream or something that they want to do, and you go back home. That sounds like something that people may want to do, but trust me, that's not okay. The reason that's not okay is even though the individual said yes, that it's what they want to do, most likely what the individual is saying is, yes, I want to be with you. Yes, I'm excited to go into the community. Yes, I just want to be a part of what you're doing. They're not necessarily saying, yes, I want to go stand in a really long line and pay your cable bill. So you are exploiting them. You're using their disability to your advantage. Again, be very mindful of exploitation. It does get a lot of people into trouble. Let's move on to the next topic. When it comes to peer-to-peer aggression, as a DSP, we must take the following actions when peer-to-peer aggression occurs or when we suspect it has occurred. Stabilize the situation by using positive practices and crisis intervention techniques. Separate the victim from the abuser. For example, you could ask the victim to take a walk with you, or you could stand in between the two individuals and redirect one of the individuals to engage in activity in another room. Once separated, you would check the victim for injuries and then check to make sure they feel safe. Immediately, directly, report this to Leadership On Call, the Internal Human Rights Advocate, or your supervisor. If the individual does not feel safe, then they will take actions and give you guidance. Then, document the situation. Be sure you indicate on the GER how you stabilized the situation, that you checked the individual for injury, what the individual stated when you asked them if they felt safe, and who you reported the incident to. Individuals may attempt to exploit each other. If this happens, explain to each individual why the situation is unfair and how it could be exploitation. For example, let's say Johnny wants to buy Mike's radio for $1, and Mike says sure. You would intervene and explain how that's not a fair trade. Johnny then tells you to mind your own business, and you explain to Johnny that that could be what we call exploitation, and you don't want him to get into trouble. You then explain that Mike's radio is worth around $50, and say to Mike, do you really want to sell it for only $1? Mike says, no way, man. Situation solved. But you would still report it directly to Leadership On Call, your supervisor, or the Internal Human Rights Advocate. Report what you have done to intervene and the outcome of what you tried. Then document it on a T-log, let's communicate. Now let's say Mike tells you, I don't care how much it's worth. I want Johnny to have it for $1. You try to persuade Mike to think about it, and he gives Johnny the radio anyway. You would then also report directly to Leadership On Call, your supervisor, or the Internal Human Rights Advocate, what you have done to intervene, the outcome of what you tried, and document it on a T-log, let's communicate. Congratulations, you have finished Session 4 of the online human rights training. Now proceed back to Moodle to take your quiz for this section.